Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show and supporting the station. If you have a question or comment about this show or any other past show, you can send an email to comment@am950radio.com. So, going to start off today's show talking about a topic that I get questions about both from my students and just from regular people. And that's about the Social Security Administration. Some of my students and other people who are, younger workers that I know are, ask me periodically, it's like, well, is Social Security even going to be there when, they're ready to retire in, 20, 30, 40 years, whatever it is, depending on how old the person is that I'm talking to. Because there's a lot of people out there that, they're hearing the, I call them in part these scare tactics, that, Social Security is going to run out of money and, what's going to happen and all this sort of stuff. So, thought what I would do with this first segment on today's show is just talk a little bit about some of the basic stuff about Social Security. So, if you're somebody who has these same questions, you can kind of, I'm hoping to give you some things you can think about and maybe ask some of the politicians that you talk to. Because basically I'm going to focus mostly on this segment here about ways to raise more money for the system. Because, that's the main thing is, we're going to run out of money. So while I go through this, however, there's going to be some ideas that I think are better than other ones, but they're ideas nonetheless for doing something about getting more money into that system. But one thing that I, again, stress that you should do is when you're out talking to politicians, particularly those on the federal level, because they're the ones that control the Social Security program, is ask them about this. What are you going to do about it? And also, by the way, I've said in prior shows too, Medicare. Because when you start hearing Republicans say things like, oh, the system's going to run out of money and, we got to reform, that's code word for, we as Republicans, we want to cut the Social Security program, basically. Because they've tried it before. When George W. Bush was in office, they were talking about privatizing and moving it in all of the stock market, and you can do what you want with it. And that failed tremendously. Never got anywhere. But still, this is what a lot of people are talking about. There's a lot of fear mongering going on. So, don't fall for all of that, because there's certainly things Congress can do. Now, one of the questions, of course, is whether Congress has the political will to do anything. That's certainly a question out there, particularly the current Congress. I doubt that they would do some of these reforms, but if, and hopefully, when the Democrats take over, at some point, they'll have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Then, they'll need to do something about this. So how can we get more money into the system? Well, before I get into that, I got to give you a little bit of a background on how Social Security works. It's not that complicated. There are some things that are like, how do they figure how much you get, that kind of stuff. That's all based on a formula. So I'm not going to go into that stuff here, but a little history will help kind of show you what some of the things Congress can do to get more money into the system. So you probably know that Social Security was passed into law during the Great Depression by FDR and the Democrats. So the Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and had the presidency back then. And they signed the law, FDR signed the law on August 14th, 1935. And the first collection of payroll taxes to help fund the system started in January of 1937. And then the first payment happened 3 years later in January of 1940. This is when the first money actually went out to people. So there is, you need to qualify in order to start getting paid. So it applies to people who have worked long enough to qualify for benefits. And that is somewhat based on, your work history and your age and that kind of thing. So I won't get into that, but you do have to qualify for it. Initially, when the law was first passed back in 1935, people did not start getting paid until they hit age 65. But there's been some changes in the law since then, where Congress has now changed it so that you can retire early, so to speak, at ages 62, 63, or 64, or older than 65 too, up to age 70. So you can wait until you're age 70 until you start getting Social Security benefits. But you can get them as early as 62. So people, one of the things people have to consider when they're looking at this is, okay, what age do I want to be when I retire? Because depending on what that age is will depend on what your benefit is. So that's based on your age, how long you worked, and then what you got paid, during that time. So some people choose to work a little bit longer if they're in a good paying job so that their benefit number goes up. People that aren't working or not working at a very high paying job, well, then they might retire a little bit early. So there is a formula that figures all that stuff out. There is something on the Social Security website where you can punch in some numbers and that kind of stuff, and they'll give you some numbers. You also get, as I'm getting closer to that age 65, I'm getting some letters from Social Security saying, hey, if you retire now, here's what your benefit's going to be. They've sort of already figured it out. They make some assumptions in there about my present salary and stuff, but so you can kind of figure out based on your work history and stuff. That formula is there on the Social Security website, and you can get a good idea. So right now, Social Security is funded by a payroll tax. So those of you who are working, right, it's like, part of your check goes to pay for Social Security. So you pay as a worker, you pay 6.2% of your income for that week. Or if you get, paid every 2 weeks, well, then you pay Social Security for every 2 weeks. Right, but they figure it each week how much that's going to be. So you pay 6.2%, and so does your employer. They pay 6.2%. So right now, it's matching. So when you add those two together, that's 12.4%. So you pay half of the money, the employer pays your half, or pays half too. So you combine those, that's 12.4%. And by the way, you also have to pay 1.45% for a Medicare tax. That also comes out of your paycheck. That's part of FICA. And your employer also pays 1.45% too. So this money is then used to pay for the benefits in the Social Security system. And typically your money that, goes in now helps pay for the people who are retired now or will be retiring in the next few years. That's where the money basically comes from, is the people who are working now fund the people who are retiring. And also when you retire at some point, the people that are working are, sending in the money that help pay for you too. So that's kind of how the system works. Now, one caveat is that if you are somebody who makes a lot of money, who makes a lot of income, if you make more than $184,500 as of 2026, any amount above the $184,500, you do not pay any Social Security tax on that, whatever else you make for the rest of that year. No taxes. So you got to pay taxes on up to $184,500 for Social Security. Now Medicare, you got to pay more. If you're above that number, there's no cap on Medicare. So, of course, this is great for rich people because that they don't have to pay 6.2%. Once they're above that cap, so they get to keep more money, and it lessens the tax burden on them compared to the rest of us. So part of the problem right now is when Social Security first started, there were 5 to 6 workers funding the retirements for one person. Nowadays, it's about 2 to 1, like 2 workers for every one person. And, part of that is because, at least right now, there's a lot more retirees than there are, and will be retiring, like baby boomers, right, than there are younger people. The population shift has been happening over the years, and this is one of the things that happens when you have population changes like we are. So right now, there's less money coming in to fund the retirements as time goes on because there's less workers and there's more people retiring. So that's what's going to happen when you have a situation like that. So that's kind of where we are at this point. So what can we do to try and get more money into the system? Well, I'm going to give you some ideas here. Now, this list is not all of them, but it's some of them. Because, in the end, this is going to depend on, what the politicians do. And some of these ideas, of course, one party prefers it over the other party and the other party wants something else. So I'll kind of give you an idea of which party supports what as we go through these lists. But, basically the Democrats want to try and fix it. They want to try and get more money in the system. Some Democrats even want to increase your benefit amount, whereas the Republicans basically want to either kill the system totally, just privatize it, turn it over to, Wall Street and let the bankers have more shot at your money. Or, cutting the benefits down to whatever to extend the lifetime of the program. So basically the Republicans basically want to just either kill it or just reduce the money that people get paid. So I'm going to give you a number of things that at least potentially can be done. And again, depends on the Congress passing these things and the president signing them, but not holding out much hope for that. But at any rate, here's some of my ideas at least. Number one, you lower the benefit amount. So let's say, you're a person, you're going to get paid $3,000 a month. Well, you can lower that to say, well, you're going to get paid $2,000 a month instead. So if every worker, loses X amount of dollars, because the benefit is lowered, that goes back into the pot, and that can help extend the program longer. So again, not the greatest of ideas, especially if you're a poor person. That means you're going to get less money. But nonetheless, again, this is just a way to keep the system in place and going longer. So obviously you can lower the benefit amount. Second, now this is one or a lot of, particularly in my students, they're like, wow, I hadn't thought about that. The second here, though, is you can get more immigrants into the United States as workers. Now, I know, ICE is throwing all these people out right now, but here's one of the problems with doing so, is that immigrants that work pay into the Social Security system, even though a lot of them don't get the benefit of it because they're not here till they retire. But they pay into the Social Security system while they are working in the United States. And many of these immigrants are younger people who won't need benefits for a while if they stay long enough. So, deporting all these immigrants actually is hurting the Social Security system itself, which is, again, I think, part of the Republican play here. They're not going to tell you that's why they're doing it, but this is part of what's going on here. They want to gut the system. So throwing all these immigrants who pay into the Social Security system is a way to do it. Now, immigrants can get benefits, assuming that they qualify, with numbers wise, but here's the big but here. They also have to have a valid green card or a valid work visa to get the benefits if they're not a citizen by then. So if they don't go through the citizenship, process and become a citizen, or if they don't have a valid green card or a valid work visa, they don't get Social Security benefits, even if they paid in for a long time. So you can get more money into the system by having more immigrants working and paying into the system. Third one here is getting rid of that cap limit that's right now at $184,500. Just get rid of it. Or if you don't want to get rid of it totally, we'll raise it up to, $1 million or something. Right? So you can get rid of that cap limit. Make it for all wage income, regardless of the amount. Because remember, that's what you're paying on. This is on your wages, through your work. That's how this system is funded. And I'll talk about that, some issues with that here in just a second here. But remember, that's at least the current system. So rich people, I've talked about this in earlier shows, they limit their wage income so that they don't have to pay that much in Social Security tax. Jeff Bezos, I think when I looked last time, at least he was paying himself $80,000 a year in salary. That's it. So I think it's enough to qualify for a earned child tax credit or something like that. So, but this is the way rich people, limit their wage income. So, getting rid of that cap will, at least the current estimates, when I looked at this, if we got rid of that cap, the current estimate is we would get roughly $3.2 trillion more over a 10-year period of time. So that would add more time to the system. So just doing that could eliminate roughly 58 to 60% of the projected shortfall. So you hear a lot of Democrats talking about get rid of the cap, right? Republicans, of course, they don't want to do it. They're not in favor of it because, they work for the rich people. Rich people don't want to get rid of that cap. So number 4 is let's change the way that we tax for the Social Security. So right now, again, it's just on your wages. Why don't we start taxing people's interest income, dividend income, they get through stocks, and even a wealth tax. Now, as I've mentioned on previous shows, you don't have to tax the poor people here. You can do targeted taxing to hit more of the rich people. To start taxing their income, their interest income, and their dividend income. That's one way they make a lot of their money because it's already taxed at a lower rate. So say for anybody over $500,000 or whatever number you want to come up with, we're going to start taxing that too and putting that towards the Social Security program. So, of course, the rich people are going to howl over this, right? Republicans would howl over this. Like, oh, you can't do that. How dare you try and get more money from the rich people? Oh, the horror. But again, it's an idea. It's something that Congress could try and do. 5th one would be to increase the payroll tax itself. Just, it's at 6.2% and 6.2%. Well, raise it for the worker. Now, again, I'm not saying that's a great idea, but you get more money in the system if you do it, right? You could also raise the amount on the employer. Now, again, you don't have to make that number equal like it is now. Right now, it's 6.2% for both employer and the employee. You can make it where it's 6.2%, for example, for the employee, but make the employer start paying 10 or 12.5% or whatever. You can increase it on the employer. So, increasing that payroll tax is something that you could do. Next one is you could just have a one-time tax of rich people, for their wealth. Just say, okay, millionaires, let's just go with them. You could do a one-time tax of, 3, 4, 5%, whatever it is on their wealth, not their income, because remember that they screw around with that number, but tax their wealth. And then whatever that money is that you collect, you throw all of that into the Social Security program to extend it a longer period of time. So even just a one-time tax, you could come up with a lot of money, or you can do it more than once if you want to. But that's just another way that you could try and get more money into the system so that you can extend the program longer. Next idea is you can have the U.S. government pay back the roughly $2.5 trillion it has borrowed from the Social Security Trust Fund. That would extend the program. Now it might might mess up the government's budgets and all that sort of stuff, but they have borrowed from the Social Security program over the years to the tune of $2.5 trillion roughly. So, if the government itself paid it back, that would extend the program longer. Then the last one here, and this is one where you hear quite a lot of people talking about this, and currently this is what the Republican Party and Trump is talking about: raising the retirement age. So right now, to get full benefits, you got to be 67, not 65, like a lot of people think. You got to be 67. For people born in 1962 or past that. So for the people that are older than that, yeah, it's 65. But for a lot of the people coming up now, it's 67. So, and the earliest you can retire is 62. Well, you can raise the retirement age to 70. And that's a number that's been bandied about here lately. People are living longer, people are working longer, although I would push back on that one. They're working longer because they have to, because they're poor. But you could raise the retirement age so that you're not paying money out as soon to people. So there would be more money in the system to pay it out later. So those are some of the ideas, at least, for trying to extend the program or get more money into the Social Security program. And again, there's other ones too, but these are just some of the basic ones that I'm throwing out there. But again, all of this comes with political problems. Congress would need to pass new laws, and that's not going to be easy. The best chance of doing that is if you give the Democrats the trifecta, where they have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Although the Supreme Court could still try and monkey wrench it somehow, but this is an issue where when you poll Democrats and Republicans, they both want Social Security fixed. They both want, and at least the last time that I looked at some of the polling, they actually both want more benefits than they're getting now by taxing the rich. So here again, ask your federal politicians, what's their view on this stuff. So. And not just Social Security. We talk about Medicare because Republicans are going after that too. So, not only does this affect Democrats, but this also affects you Republicans as well. Do you want to lose your benefits or not get them at all? So, starting to put some pressure on the politicians will help. All right, we'll take our break here. When we come back, I'm going to talk some more about income inequality and some of those issues, as this is also another one that people talk about quite a bit. So we'll talk about that here on the other side of the break on Politics Matters Show. All right, welcome back to the Politics Matter Show, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. All right, so just talked about the Social Security program for a little bit. So I had done a show probably a month ago now, maybe a little bit longer, where I talked about some things about wealth and income inequality and then how rich people dodge taxes. And I got some response from some listeners about that. So I'm going to be talking more about that here in this segment, and maybe even the next one, depending on how long this takes. But I thought about this because I had some friends over recently, and the issue of rising costs of housing in the city that I live in came up. And the average price of a house right now in Minnesota is roughly $356,000. And that number, of course, keeps going up. It's higher in some areas in the metro area where, it's not unheard of that the average cost is over $400,000. But, of course, it's less out in rural Minnesota where, I think the last number that I saw there was like around $200,000, $250,000. You can find houses out in rural Minnesota. But still, I mean, that's a lot of money, and that number keeps going up and up and up. So, and you're seeing, at least in the metro area here, you're seeing all kinds of new rental homes, like they're building single family rental homes. They're building all kinds of apartments. They're building all kinds of townhomes that you can buy or rent in this area as well. And it's getting to the point for, buying a home, many people can't afford it anymore because, a lot of this new stuff that's being built is not for poor people or low income people. It's for the rich people or the people who can afford to pay the high price. And if you're somebody who rents because you cannot buy a house, rent is not going down either. Rent is shooting up just as much as house prices are. So, part of what's going on here is there's a lot of private equity firms buying houses or apartments or building them, and they're jacking up the prices. So they make money on it for their investors. You're seeing more and more of that going on around the country. So we were, my friends and I were talking, and when it got around to me, I was talking about, well, this is an issue with housing for sure, but it's not just housing. The prices are going up and all this stuff. I mean, this is part of wealth inequality in this country, getting worse and worse and worse. Where, if you look at housing, of course, the rich people keep buying homes for themselves. A lot of them have multiple homes, or they buy them as investments, resulting in higher prices because, the demand for housing is not going down, right? The demand for rental apartments is not going down. So when demand is, still up there, well, they can charge more money. That's basic supply and demand. All right, the more demand there is, you're going to see more higher prices because the supplier can get it from people. So, this is what happens when you give the wealthy more economic power than the rest of us. Because if the rest of us had more economic power, we wouldn't be, a lot of this stuff wouldn't be going on in our country right now. But of course we don't. The wealthy have the power. They got the money and they're getting more of the money. They're buying off more politicians. So it's getting worse in this country. And of course the rich people, they can't spend all the money that they have or all the assets that they have. Like a lot of people in our economy, like, you get your paychecks, you go home, you pay your bills, and, you got hopefully you got a little bit of money left over and you go spend it on whatever it is you're spending on. Or hopefully you have a little bit to save. Well, the rich, the money that they use, I mean, they, one rich person and one regular person spend, similar on basic stuff. But the rich people, of course, they spend their money on a lot of different other things than we do. So, they got to use all that extra money that they don't spend on whatever it is they spend money on. And they got to do something else with it to keep increasing their wealth, keep increasing their assets. So they buy a bunch of stuff like houses or gold or jewelry or artwork or, whatever it is, which drives up the prices. It's also not a coincidence that, the stock market's high right now. Land prices are up, gold prices are up, grocery prices are up. Because in these areas, the rich are putting money into those areas and increasing their assets. So this is what's going on in our economy and in our system. They got to put their passive income somewhere. Because, they're not out there working, at a job all day long like we are. They get a lot of their income through their investments, which is what passive income is. So, and they don't have as much debt to, they have to pay off as we do. And we're lucky if we were able to pay our debts off and save a little bit. So the people right now who have the wealth and the power in our system, the rich people, of course, they are going to continue to take power and money from the less powerful of the people, which is us. And particularly in the United States, again, you can legally bribe politicians to stay in power and to pass laws that favor you, the rich person, and not favor you, the poor person. So this is the cycle that we're stuck in today. So, it wasn't always this way. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, this is the time where our economy boomed. We started having the middle class. They started to get more, more money at this time. You basically, you only needed one person in the household to work. You could afford a house. You could buy a car. You went on vacation. You might even had a second house. Right? And remember, at this particular time, the rich people were taxed at around 90%. But, of course, the rich people started complaining about that as time went on. So then when you start looking as to what happened in the late 70s, and you can kind of see this was going to be happening under Ronnie Reagan. But in the 1980s and moving forward, all that changed, where now the top tax rate is only 37%. So we have effectively, through law changes, rule changes, getting rid of regulations, right? We've basically given all that money that we, the middle class, had gotten in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Now it's all back with the rich people again. And they're going to continue to try and get more of it from us. Right? And income inequality and wealth inequality is accelerating. It's not slowing down. It's getting worse. We're losing money. The size of the pie, right? The middle class, we're losing the money. The government's losing money. But the rich people aren't. They're getting more. Right? They're raking it in right now. So, and they're benefiting from a bunch of tax laws that favor them, which I'll get to here in just a minute. But just to give you a sense of how much the rich people have, taken from us, since 1975, nearly $80 trillion has been redistributed from the middle class to the wealthy in the United States. There was I think it was a Rand Corporation that did this study. $80 trillion. Imagine what we, the middle class, or even the poor people too, like the rest, 99% of us, or the bottom half, or whatever, however you want to term that. Imagine what we could do as a country if we would have been able to keep that $80 trillion. And it didn't get turned over or redistributed to the rich people in this country. Things would be a lot different than they are today. So how are the rich people doing this? Well, let's focus on some of the tax advantages that they have. This is one of the big reasons that they have the advantages. They get the politicians to pass these laws that benefit them, all these loopholes, and they don't have to pay as much in taxes. It's pretty simple. But you'll hear the rich people, I pay millions of dollars in taxes. Well, yeah, but you're not paying proportionally what the rest of us are as a percentage of your income. That's the part they're not telling you. Plus, a lot of them, they're getting refunds. And some of them, if they have a business, they're getting credits for future taxes because of all the loopholes that they get. So, of course, one of the ways is that they avoid taking big salaries, so they don't have to pay as much in income taxes. Right? They don't need a high-paying job to stay rich, so they don't. They don't have one. They purposely limit their income there because they pay less in taxes. Another way is they buy assets like stocks, arts, cars, land, houses, those sorts of things, because they don't pay any tax on these assets until they sell them. So the asset wealth that they get from those once they buy it, that appreciates over time. In other words, it gets more and more it's worth more and more as time goes on. They don't have to pay any tax on that increase until they sell the item. By the way, a lot of the rich people don't sell the item. Then it passes to their, it gets inherited by the next generation, and the next generation doesn't pay a tax on it, on that increase. Yeah. So, and a lot of these assets that they buy, they pay a smaller capital gains tax, which is either, depending on how much they show for their taxable income, is either 0%, 15%, or 20%, depending on the taxpayer. So let's assume you're at the 20%. I mean, that's a lot less than the 37% if you were in the highest income tax bracket or paying your income taxes. So another thing about capital gains, if you're in, let's say you're in the stock market, right? And one year your stocks just tanked. I mean, you had losses in a lot of it. You get to write those off against your taxes as a capital gains loss. And then you subtract that from your capital gains net, to limit your capital gains tax. Or in some cases, if you're at the end of the year at you get a negative number there, it's a deduction. See how the rich people love the tax system? So another way that they avoid paying higher taxes is to claim their earnings as investment income. So if you're able to do that, then you pay at the lower capital gains amount. So these guys basically are like fund managers in private equity firms or venture capital and hedge funds, right? People that work in those types of businesses. They're all compensated in part with a share of their fund's profits, which is typically 20% these days. And this is called carried interest. So carried interest constitutes a vast majority of the income for these types of people. The loophole here is that carried interest is taxed at the lower capital gains tax of 20% instead of the 37% if treated as income. So here again, they get to pay a lesser tax. Plus, that income, investment income, they don't have to take out Social Security or Medicare either because it's not a payroll tax. So they benefit from that too. So let's say you're a single person, you're driving an Uber car, right? Let's say you make $100,000 a year driving. Okay, you're a single person. You got to pay at least under the brackets now. You're paying 22% income tax, 6.2% for Social Security, and 1.45% for Medicare, which is a total of 29.65%. We'll round that up to 30%. You're paying 30% tax. If you are a single Uber investor, all right, and your stocks in Uber go up $100,000, you pay just a 15% capital gains tax and no payroll taxes. That's good for you. So you're paying nearly 30% as the driver, but you're only paying 15% if you're an investor. Again, it's half basically. See how that works to the advantage of a rich person? You can see why there's people ask me all, why are there's all these loopholes in the law? This is why. The rich people find creative ways to avoid paying taxes, and they buy off politicians, particularly Republicans, but there's certainly some Democrats in there as well, to pass the laws. They have the power. They want to stay in power. This is how they do it. This is how they stay rich, among other things. All right, we're going to take our next break here, and we'll keep talking about some of this stuff here when we come back on the other side of the break here on the Politics Matter Show with Bruce Klopfleisch. All right, welcome back to the third and final segment of this week's Politics Matter Show. I'm Bruce Klopfleisch, your host. Thanks for tuning in. So let's continue on with some of the the way the rich people use taxes to stay in power and to take more money from us, ultimately, because they're able to buy more assets because they have all the money. So here's another one that they use under the tax code where, I mentioned earlier how they can buy all these assets, right? Well, one thing they can do when they buy all these assets is they use them as collateral, and they get loans for their value from a bank with, fairly cheap interest on it that they got to pay back, but they get loans. So they get this cash, whatever number you want to put in there. That's how they live. That's the money they live off of, and reinvest or buy more assets with it, as long as they can pay back the loan, right? But this is what they do. They use the stuff that they have as collateral for a bank loan, and they take that money and live off it. And you might be asking, well, why are they doing that? Well, because they pay the money back tax-free. The money that they get from the banks to live off of is tax-free money. So, yeah, even though you probably got to pay some interest on your loans, you don't have to pay any tax on all that money that you got from the bank, right? Because it's a loan. This is how they're able to finance their lifestyles without needing a big, income salary, right? This is what they're doing. Plus, with these, if you are buying these assets and they're treated as capital gains, you don't pay taxes on it until the asset is sold. You can't do that. You and I can't do that with our wages, but they do it when they buy all these assets, all their investments. So they can control the timing of when they either buy or sell these assets and at what price, so that they can, fudge around with their tax numbers. All the while they're getting, compounding, interest and growth over time without paying taxes on that. And again, if you do not sell during your lifetime and it goes to your beneficiaries, all that additional appreciation does not get taxed. When it goes to your people who inherit, they start over at that high number, whatever the fair market value is at the time that you die. That's the number they start out with. So all that growth was tax-free. So because the U.S. doesn't tax gains on property given away during your life or transferred at death. People who inherit they start over at that higher price for their capital gains, and they don't pay tax on it. This is what's called a stepped up basis. Maybe you've heard of that term. So there's no tax on the accumulating value for those who, keep it until they die. So this is what a lot of the big wealthy families and dynasties, if you will, that's what they do. They keep all this stuff, so it passes to the next generation tax-free. So this loophole is used again and again within, these families to ever increase, their wealth and growth in value of their assets over time. And they get more concentration of the wealth when it goes from generation to generation. This is how they stay in power and get more power, because when they're not paying taxes on this stuff, they're using that money that they would usually, if we had, fair tax laws, they buy more assets. And one of the things about economics, of course, is there are limited assets. There's only so much out there, and they're buying up more and more and more of it. So here's another loophole for the wealthy: stock buybacks. You probably heard of that too. Now, this was not legal until 1982 there it is again, Ronnie Reagan. If you go back and you look at a lot of stuff about income inequality and wealth inequality in the United States, you see that it really starts taking off starting in the 1980s. And there's a reason for that, because of the Reagan administration, changing all the rules and regulations and laws. So this is one that they did. In 1982, they changed the rule from the Securities and Exchange Commission that basically says now companies can buy back their own stocks in the open market. They can also, pay their employees with stocks. And then the employees later sell out the stocks. Right? And in doing so, where you're allowing companies to buy back their own stocks on the open market, that drives up the price of the stocks, which is good for the rich people. And there's less stocks out there. So you and I have a harder time buying them if we can even afford them. That's a whole nother issue, of course, here, right? But this is what they do. They do it so they can increase the sale price of the stock by adding some buyers to the market. So, the people who can afford it and these, CEOs of these companies, right? They can buy the stocks if they want. So this reduces the tax liability of the rich investors by moving them from recipients of dividends like in, before, where that's what you get when your stock increase in value. Dividends are taxed. But now if you're a holder of a stock, that's tax-free growth and value. So this is why most of the bigger companies are doing this today. If you look at the CEO pay of the state of Minnesota, you can see how it's breakdown with salary. But if you look at stocks, that's now a big number for a lot of these guys. And this is one reason why they're doing it this way. So in 2024, the CEOs in the large companies got about 70% of their compensation was by stocks from their own companies. And when companies do it like this, okay, they're not using their profit or their growth, money or whatever. They're not using that money to invest in the company. They're not using that money to pay their employees higher wages or giving them more benefits. Right? And then when you inherit, if you hold your stuff long enough, the people who get the inheritance, they don't pay any types of distributions. Because most of these people, right, they put their assets in trusts, and then there's loopholes with inheritance taxes. And the inheritance taxes are so high, the number needed to get there is a pretty high number. But this is how they have more money, and this is how they're able to buy up more assets in our economy. All right, have a good week. We will talk to you next week on the Politics Matter Show.